In this video, I'm going to look at the 10 richest Somalis of the 19th century. And this is a very interesting list. We need to bear in mind that the Somali society has always had people who are so much into commerce, and it has produced some of the most successful merchants of the eastern coast of Africa. Now, this list, these are people who have come across being mentioned in the different books that I've read. And we are going to go through this list and we see the names that appear there. Now, the first on my list is Haji Shamarke Ali Saleh. The Europeans of the 19th century came to call him the African Rothschild, at least maybe the historians later. Of course, if you don't know who the Rothschilds are, this is considered to be the richest family maybe in the last 300 years, globally speaking. So the Europeans came to call Shamarke the African Rothschild because of how vast his wealth was. And many consider him to be the richest, to have been the richest Somali of the 19th century. Seems like he started from a very humble beginning, sort of. Maybe yes, maybe no. He started as a captain of a ship. And it seems like he spent a lot of time in Aden, working there. Then he started doing some commerce. He became a merchant, basically. But then he acquired political power at some point. Now, where I first read about him is Richard Burton's book, First Steps in East Africa. He mentions, that is, Richard Burton mentions leaving Aden, coming to Zeila, and being hosted by Shamarke. And he says that Shamarke knew of him coming because the British had talked to him about him. The British government, that is, needed Shamarke to help Richard Burton. Richard Burton had been sent on an expedition to Harar to collect information that the British needed so that they could control the port of Berbera. Now, here is something that Richard Burton mentions that is very interesting, and that is that Shamarke had his own goals, and in fact, Shamarke was trying to use the British to achieve his own goals. While the British were trying to use him to achieve their own goals, Shamarke had his own goals. And the British were aware of this because Burton mentions it actually in his book, The First Steps to East Africa. Now, anyway, Burton explains that he arrives at Zeila, he's welcomed by Shamarke. They pretend like they've never met, and they don't even bring it up that they had had a conversation earlier, or a conversation had been had earlier about Burton visiting Zeila and going to Harar. Now, of course, some interesting things happen at Zeila while Burton is being hosted by Shamarke, including meeting different other people who were there, including meeting his son, who had also ended up becoming a very wealthy Somali merchant. His name was also Shamarke, the son. And Shamarke the son, they shared some books with Burton. Seems like the son used to read a lot, which is a very interesting detail he provides. He also talks about running into this idea of mosquitoes causing malaria. This is 1850s actually, and at this time the Europeans did not believe that malaria was caused by mosquitoes. In fact, Burton writes a note saying that this was superstitious beliefs of the Somalis. Anyways, later on, like 50 years later, scientists come to prove that actually mosquitoes spread malaria. That's something that is mentioned in the book. Anyways, so Haji Shamarke turns out grew very wealthy, and he became, in First Steps to East Africa, Burton describes him as the governor of Zeila. That's how the Europeans came to see him, and he ruled over Zeila, and then later on he did actually come to rule over Berbera. I don't know whether to say that his using of the British was successful or not really, because Burton also did reach Berbera later on and he was chased away. So Haji Shamarke did manage to rule over Zeila, and he also managed to rule over Berbera. And he seemed to have been in very good terms with the Ottomans. Remember, the Ottomans during this time had a lot of influence in the Horn of Africa. So he managed to become very friendly with them. And out of that, he ran a lot of businesses and doing merchant work. He used his own money often to sponsor operations for, we could say, government. He used his own personal finance in that way sometimes. His son also, the younger Shamarke, did also become a very successful merchant. We could say beginning maybe 1860s. The father was very active beginning, that is Haji Shamarke was very active beginning 1840s, at least going by but on mentioning him because the book is published in 1850s. The second one is Sultan Ahmed Yusuf. Now, Sultan Ahmed Yusuf was from the Guled Sultanate in the southern part of Somalia. The first place where I came across this name of this individual is when I was reading Virginia Luling's book, the Somali Sultanate, Guled City-State, 150 Years. This is a more recent book, of course, was published in the year, I think, 2010s, if I'm not wrong, a very recent book, actually. But she tells us about visiting the Guled Sultanate going as far back as 1960s. But she uses material from one Wilmot Christopher. Lieutenant Wilmot Christopher visited um, the Guled Sultanate and the entire Somali coast in 1840s. And he met Ahmed Yusuf and his brothers, and he describes that meeting. Actually, that article that was published by the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society is part of the book that is titled The Somali and Their Lands, which you can get on Amazon, and you can check the description box and the pinned comment for that. So Sultan Ahmed Yusuf, he came from what came to be known as the Gobron dynasty that ruled over the Guled Sultanate. And they were very, very powerful. And besides ruling over the Guled Sultanate, he was also a lot into commerce. And in fact, some of the wars he was fighting were mostly because of commerce. For example, when Wilmot visited, he had this issue with a certain group of, we could call them religious order. And they fought over that religious order, bringing this teaching that it was unclean to handle ivory. And Yusuf was not happy about that because he realized that that was going to affect business. He also got so much involved with what was happening in Mogadishu, and he wanted to have influence. And he did have influence over the politics of Mogadishu. And in fact, he did try to convince Wilmot Christopher to accompany him to Mogadishu, I think, where there were two factions that were trying to seize power. And all that was because of commerce. There is a talk of the brother of Sultan Yusuf talking about or telling Wilmot that he will be happy and his brother will be happy if the British will join them into a sort of a joint venture to go and establish a port somewhere along the coast. So he was so much into trading, but he was also a military genius. He could put together an army of 20,000 troops and fight around. So he was very good as a military leader, but also very good at doing business. Him and his brothers, at least two brothers are mentioned by Wilmot in that article. Now, besides doing merchant or selling or importing and exporting stuff, especially through Afgoy, Mogadishu, and Marka, specifically Mogadishu and Marka, he also was so much into farming. Remember, the Guled Sultanate, especially as described by Virginia Luling, was a lot into farming, agriculture. So he was so much into agriculture. That side, that part of Somalia used to do a lot of grain growing. We could say maybe corn and sorghum and also other things like cotton and things like that. And there was also a lot of people doing weaving cotton products from that part of Somalia. So he was into that kind of commerce, and seems like he made a lot of money out of that, and over time he grew to be very, very wealthy. Virginia Luling describes in detail the family of Sultan Ahmed Yusuf. She provides very good details actually about the father and the brothers and the grandfather and the start of the Gobron dynasty. She provides the family tree in the book. Very interesting, actually. But as I said, she got a lot of material from Wilmot Christopher's visit in 1840 because Wilmot Christopher met Yusuf in person and they had conversations. And Wilmot describes him as a very intelligent man because he says that he was asking questions about everything. He was a very curious man, that is. He would ask him questions regarding even the socks that he was wearing, how they were manufactured. He was a kind of a man who wanted to understand things, and maybe that explains how he ended up becoming a very wealthy man. The third person on my list of the most or the wealthiest Somalis of the 19th century is one Bogor Osman Mahamuud. Now, he was very active beginning 1850s up to 1920s when he passed on. Now, he was of the Majarten royalty, we can say. The family ruled over the Majarten, especially in Alula, that is at the tip of the Horn of Africa. And they were based mostly Alula or Bosaso, and sometimes Aden. Remember, during this time, most Somalis who were into commerce mostly were also had a lot of activity in Aden, and that was the same case with Bogor. Now, Bogor Osman Mahamuud I've come across the mention of his son, not him in particular, but of course there is a talk of the family. And the son is discussed a lot by one Douglas Collins in his book, A Tear for Somalia, book published very recently, actually 1960. And when I say recent 1960, it's because I usually look at books that are much older than that. Now, Douglas Collins talks about meeting his son, who was a sultan and based in Alula. And actually, Douglas Collins ended up dating the granddaughter, could be the granddaughter of Bogor Osman Mahamuud, or the grand niece, if it makes sense. She was by the name Amina, and Douglas Collins describes the relationship. Sometimes he describes it as they were trying to take advantage of him. Remember, this family, okay, I need to mention this. This family made a lot of money through the export of frankincense, maidi, as the Somalis probably call it, and I think that's how it's pronounced, the smelling good gums of the trees of the Horn of Africa. That's how they made a lot of their money, or that's from where they made a lot of the money, the family of Bogor Osman Mahamuud. And they did have huge tracts of land. Now, Douglas Collins describes a situation where there were the Midgan. There was a dispute between some Midgan families and Bogor Osman Mahamuud at Alula over some pieces of land that had or were producing these frankincense and myrrh. And Bogor, I think is the son of Osman Mahamuud, was trying to convince Douglas Collins, who had been sent by the British as we could say he was a local administrator, to rule in their favor. And Douglas Collins describes him getting into a relationship with Amina as a setup, that the family of Bogor Osman Mahamuud set him up with this girl, and she was very irresistible. And they had this thing going on for some time. And at some point, they had a huge fight, and the fight was over him not ruling in favor of the Bogor Osman Mahamuud's family regarding the ownership of these lands. But anyways, that's the story in the book. Now, this family turned out to have grown very wealthy. And it started with Bogor Osman Mahamuud. He was a sultan. He was a ruler, an elder of the Majarten Sultanate. And he's considered, of course, to be a monarch, sort of. But the Somalis generally not have monarchs that are the same as monarchs in other parts of the world. It was a unique form of monarchy. But anyways, he was a monarch, and he accumulated pieces of land, and he grew a lot of these plants, and he did a lot of export. Probably the family did also buy from other farmers and exported, and that's how they made a lot of money. And they ended up to becoming one of the richest families of Somali families of the 19th century. The fourth is Sultan Yusuf Ali Henete or Anete Yusuf Ali Mahamuud. Now, he was also from the same place, that is Alula, in the Majarten land, and he was actually the cousin of Bogor Osman. They were cousins, and he lived between 1845 and 1911. We can assume he was into the same business, mostly exporting frankincense and myrrh, and maybe importing some other stuff. But there is also a mention of him exporting ivory and hides and livestock to Aden. And I've mentioned this in other videos that at some point the Somalis were supplying close to 80,000 animals to Aden annually, a lot of animals. So people must have made a lot of money out of that. And Sultan Yusuf Ali Anate or Yusuf Ali Mahamuud, the cousin of Bogor Osman, also was into a lot of commerce, and he grew to become one of the most successful, wealthy Somalis in the 19th century. In 1878, the Majarten split, and there was a creation of the Sultan of the Sultanate of Hobyo. And I think he participated in that. He had something to do with that. there is historical documents showing that he actually participated in that, and also ended up signing some treaties with the Italians. And we've looked at some of these treaties, and there is a book actually that I've been talking about the treaties that the Somalis signed with different powers, and other treaties that were signed about the lands of the Somalis. You can also check my list. And yeah, he participated in that. He signed some treaties, and at some point, he was exiled to Eritrea. And the reason he was exiled to Eritrea, this is something I've also come across in another book, and the book is by Douglas Jardines. The book is titled Mad Mullah. The Mad Mullah of Somaliland, and this is a book that discusses the Dervish Wars, and they talk about this gentleman refusing to cooperate with the British over putting some soldiers in Hobyo to fight Mohamed Abdullah Hassan, and he was taken to Eritrea, and his son was made to become the Sultan of Hobyo for some time. Anyways, that's a big story, or a very long story. Anyways, he was one of the richest Somalis of the 19th century. Number 5 is Sultan Nur Hamed Aman. Now, he lived between 1840s and 1907, and he was a sultan, actually. He was a sultan of the Habre Yunis Sultanate, and he was based mostly in Burao, Berbera, around that region. Now, Sultan Nur Hamed made a lot of his money inland, where the others were making a lot of their money trading with outside. When I say outside, I mean outside the Horn of Africa, mostly to Aden, and of course selling to people who are coming from other parts of the world. Sultan Nur Hamed made his money through internal caravans, and these are caravans that were moving from Ethiopia to the coast, to Berbera, Zeila, and such places, transporting goods that will then be exported. Likely was selling those goods to other people who will then export them outside. Mostly he was dealing in livestock. And as I said, during this time, the Somalis were selling huge amounts of livestock to Aden. He was also into frankincense, coffee, ostrich feathers, and ivory, things like that. He would bring them from Ethiopia and then maybe sell them at the coast, or maybe had some people take them out to other places. Now, one other notable thing about this gentleman is that he was part of the inner circle of Mohamed Abdullah Hassan, the founder or the person who led the Dervish Wars. He was a very close ally of his, and I think it is Douglas Jardine who mentions that he used to help him acquire weapons or things like that, and the British were not very happy with him regarding that. And I think the British did talk to the Italians about his activities. I think it is in that book. And besides providing weapons, he will also act as a diplomat for Mohamed Abdullah Hassan, talking to other powers, specifically the Ottomans, trying to get them to get involved and to help Mohamed Abdullah Hassan. Now, the 6th is Abban Haji Mohamed. Now, this one is a unique individual on this list, and this is because most of the others were sultans. He wasn't really a sultan, even though it seems like he came from sort of a royal family. He wasn't a sultan. He was an Abban, and Abbans were brokers, basically. When you read the book written by Ibn Battuta about his travels, he mentions the unique institution of Abban in the coast of East Africa, especially the Somali coast, where there will be these individuals who will be at the coast, at the ports, and when you arrive as an outsider, maybe especially to come and do commerce, and sometimes to visit, really, you will have to attach yourself to one of them, and then they will be your guide. They will provide security. They will take care of you. They will transact on your behalf. They were called Abbans. Richard Burton does also mention them. In fact, most of these old documents about the east coast of Africa, I think even Wilmot Christopher mentions the Abbans in his article that is part of the book, The Somalis and Their Lands. And the Abbans were very useful. They played a very critical role in being like the interface when it came to import and export. So this gentleman, Haji Mohamed, was an Abban. He was a broker. That's all he did. And he became very wealthy out of it, actually. He became very wealthy. And he was active between the 1830s and 1870s. And actually, Richard Burton does mention him in his book, First Steps to East Africa. He became very successful at talking to Arabs and the Europeans and the Indians, all these different people who were maybe bringing in stuff and trying to buy stuff that they will take out. And of course, as an Abban, he was making a profit out of each of these transactions. And in fact, he said at some point, especially in the 1840s, he was like, he had all the broker monopoly at Berbera. He was, of course, mostly based at Berbera. He became like the only guy who, especially the major ships, will deal with when they come to Berbera to do business. Remember, Berbera had this annual trade fair that happened, and that must have been a huge source of income for him. So at some point, he became like the monopoly on this port, and major ships from India, from the Arabian Peninsula, from Europe would deal with him. And of course, he made a lot of money. And he, at some point, expanded and he established himself at Aden, building a warehouse or acquiring warehouses, huge warehouses at Aden. And so he will bring in goods from maybe the Horn of Africa to Aden, or maybe collect goods from Aden, bring to the Horn of Africa. And he had all these huge facilities at Aden as warehouses where he will keep his stuff, his goods. So anyways, he became one of the wealthiest Somalis of the 19th century. Number 7 is Sultan Farah Guled. Now, he was active between 1780s and 1845, so it's much older than the others who I've talked about. And he was a sultan 1800s to 1845, and he was a sultan of the Isak. And he was based mostly at Ton, Berbera, and some other places. He made his money from a mixture of sources. He used to do trading like the others on this list, exporting, importing, but he also used to tax for grazing lands. It seems like he used to do this at least for some lands that he owned or he had control over. People would pay taxes to graze on those lands. He also taxed transit taxes, mostly for goods that were coming from places like Ethiopia or going to Ethiopia. He would tax, get some cut of the money that was being generated from that kind of activities, and he grew very wealthy out of that. Now, something that is very notable about this individual, at some point he was very powerful. 1820s, 1830s was the height of his power. And during this time, he had these diplomatic conversations with states like Persia. He will send them letters, they will have communications, and he would get some naval or military help from them sometimes. So he used to have these international, we could say, networks that he had built as, of course, a sultan. Now, there is something that Richard Burton mentions in his book, First Steps in East Africa, at the very initial pages of the book. And it is him trying to explain the relationship that had existed between the Somalis and the British government in the 1820s, 1830s, and the justification that he was providing why they needed to control Berbera and Zeila to some extent. And it was the attack on a ship that happened in the 1820s, not 1820s. There is a ship that was attacked. I think it was called Mary Ann. The ship probably wrecked, and it was attacked, and things like that happened. And the British were very angry about it, and there was very strong negative feelings towards the Somali coast. And but later on, the British did manage to have a conversation with the leaders of that region, and this gentleman was among those who negotiated with the British, and they signed some treaties about having the British ships pass through the coast without any trouble. But this happened in 1827. And Richard Burton mentions it actually, and he provides a timeline of how things happened. Number 8 is Haji Ali Warsangali. He came from the Warsangali Somalis, and he was active 1850s, 1890s. That's the time he was very active. He was mostly based at Las Corey and Aden and Bombay, India. So this seems to be a gentleman who had built a large network, we could say, in 3 continents. That's Africa, of course, and Asia. Maybe we could say in the Indian subcontinent, we can call it another continent, basically. Probably he did have some networks in Europe during this time. And he built, his business was mostly in the frankincense, the nice smelling gums from the Horn of Africa. And he was a major seller of that, exporter. And he owned ships. So he didn't like rely on other people's ships. He owns his own ships, and he will use those ships to export, of course, these Maidi and Yakga, and also used to go to India, as I've said, to Aden, and will take this stuff. And I guess he used also to import some stuffs, but mostly he made his money by owning ships and then, of course, exporting these frankincense and myrrh. Very notable, interesting thing about this gentleman is that wherever he used to do business with, he will establish a farm. He had established a farm in Bombay that was a very successful, and he established it so that he could bypass intermediaries. He did not like intermediaries. He liked doing direct business. So he established farms in Bombay. He established a farm in Aden, and that will do business. And he also used to be very careful about the security of his goods. And for that reason, he had his custom built dhows, ships, small ships that is, that were equipped with weapons, artillery to be specific, so that they will protect his ships to make sure that they are not attacked. He was a very serious gentleman, seems like. And of course, that made him money. He made a lot of money. He ended up becoming one of the most successful and wealthy Somalis of the 19th century. I need also to mention that he is also another on this list who was not really a sultan. So while the others, most of the others actually, this is a second person who was not a sultan but managed to make a lot of money as a merchant. Number 9 is Sheikh Abikar Gafle. Now, Gafle was very active 1880s to 1910s, and he came from Lower Shebele region. And of course, mostly was based at Marka and others, but mostly Marka and then the hinterland. And he made most of his money from agriculture. Of course, southern Somalia is known for being huge on agriculture. So he did do a lot of farming. He also did a lot of livestock keeping. And mostly he kept, or mostly grew grains. More we can assume sorghum and maybe maize. And he also kept a lot of cattle. And he would supply most of these grains and cattle to Arabia through his own networks. He built his own chains. Also Zanzibar, he did supply some food to Zanzibar. Now, while he wasn't, we could say, a sultan, really, he was active in politics. And he was part of the Biomal, I think it's the Bimal Sultanate in the southern part of Somalia. And he seems like he sponsored most of the anti-colonial resistance that happened. The Bimal are among the sultanate in the southern part of Somalia that actually resisted the Italians very early on. And he seemed to have played a major role. And probably using his money, he did fund some things or sponsor some things and gave the Italians a lot of difficulty with the Bimal. Number 10 is Haji Aden of Aden. Now, as the name suggests, he was a Somali mostly based in Aden. And he was active between 1835 and 1870s. And of course, he came from Zeila. Seems like he came from Zeila. And then he will do business between Zeila and Aden for the most part. And the British came to consider him to be the wealthiest settled Somali merchant in southern Arabia. So he stood out outside Somalia for being very wealthy in Arabia, or the southern part of Arabia. And he owned a lot of real estate in Aden. And I've said this in another video that there was a time that Aden, you had close to 50% of the population was Somali. Of course, that changed over time, but there was a time that Somalis composed a very significant portion of the city of Aden. Anyways, so this gentleman did own a lot of real estate, and he had wholesale operations going on. He used to supply cattle, he used to supply sheep, ghee, firewood to the British garrison there, and things like that. And he made a lot of money from Aden, actually. Some sources say that he managed to sign exclusivity, such he got exclusive access to some of the markets in Aden. There were those. The British, for some reason, came to trust him so much and gave him exclusive access to either markets, or they bought from him exclusively. And of course, he made a lot of money out of that. And he also had warehouses at Aden and other facilities like that. Besides Aden, at some point in 1860s, he established operations at the Suez Canal in Egypt. It seems like he build his own, could be warehouse or bought a warehouse there, and also had his own ships and things like that. And he ran some operations there. So yeah, so that's the list of the 10 wealthiest Somalis of the 19th century. And if you look at, maybe I should do another video about the 10 wealthiest families, Somali families of the 19th century. But most of these people come from those families. There are a few, I was checking, there are a few families that don't have individuals who appear on this list, but by and large, these individuals come from those families. I know you might be wondering why I get some of this information. Check the description box, check the pinned comment, and if you are watching on TikTok, check the bio, my profile bio. I provide my reading list. You can go check my reading list, and you can also get some of these books and read for yourself. Those are my random thoughts.